6 years ago, the Law Commission explicitly recommended that a law be introduced which would allow a court recommend the length of time that a person who receives a mandatory life sentence would remain in prison, should remain in prison. No law has been passed since then, and no law to bring this length of time about. The objective of my bill here this evening is to fulfil that recommendation and bring that length of time about. I accept that my short bill, as currently drafted, could lend itself to amendments at committee stage and to ensure that the wording actually delivers on the objective that I hope to achieve. But more importantly, what the victims of murder and their families have rightly looked for, they have been looking for this justice for years, and they are represented here this evening. This short bill has a core amendment to the Criminal Justice Act 1990, an act which, amongst other things and alongside other legislation, provides for the mandatory life sentence for murder in this country. This bill will provide certainty. It's a very important word, certainty in specific cases as to when a murderer may potentially be released. It will provide certainty to the family of the victims, to our community and indeed to the offenders. The House will be aware we have a mandatory life sentence for murder in this country, regardless of the nature or hue of that terrible event. But life does not mean life. It is not a custodial sentence for life, or indeed anything pertaining to a significant portion of life. The offender instead is under licence for life. It is in actual fact a 7-year minimum custodial sentence, and at this point the parole board may assess the murderer's suitability for release, and after that at 3-year intervals. In the late 70s and indeed the 80s in this country, a sentence for murder rarely reached double figures. Now it is averaging around 17 to 18 years, with some, of course, serving more and some serving less. According to figures supplied to the Minister in March of this year, there are 348 murderers currently serving time in our jails, all of whom have received mandatory life sentences. And yet, on average, these murderers will spend just about 17.5 years in jail, which is amongst the lowest average sentence in Europe and the world. In 2001, thanks to information from SAVE, there were 139 murderers in jail. Today there are 355, the 75% increase. Let me repeat now, there is no certainty about their sentencing. There is no certainty for the families of the victims, there is no certainty for the community, and there is no certainty for the offender. Let me now tell you something about the families and the victims of murder that are sitting in our gallery today. I have the privilege of standing here as a senator and as a patron of ADVIC, who are advocates for the victims of homicide, and as a conduit for all other organisations, SAVE being one of them, and indeed other individuals who are here representing their families and victims of violent murder. And ADVIC has been one of my greatest teachers since I came in. And we all find teachers in here. They come on to committees and they tell us the way the world is really working, and we act as a conduit, or we should be the servants of the people and acting as a conduit for them. And in fact, that is the greatest role of the Senate here. I welcome you to the Senate this evening. You are families and communities and wider society, and you have suffered more than we will ever know. And I welcome John O'Keefe, the non-executive director of ADVIC here, because he has actually taught me, as a lawyer, as a forensic psychologist, as a magistrate, has taught me about this journey and how this journey, to navigate this journey, and about the law. Everybody believes, and everybody in here believes, this will never happen to me. It's too ugly. Well, it happened to hundreds of people in Ireland, and none of us can imagine the horror of the families left behind and that they go through every day because of the profound loss at the hands of violence and unfair treatment, especially when it comes to the word certainty. This bill is about murder. Nothing but murder, purposeful, willful, horrific murder. The short amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill is all about the possibility of introducing that certainty to the minimum length of the mandatory life sentence. This currently exists in the Scottish system and also in a broader sense in England and in Wales. The core amendment of the bill simply states that the court at its discretion, I have written set, change to recommend a certain determinate period of time that a person shall spend in prison. Two important points need to be made, Lascahirlock, about this simple amendment. The first is the element of judicial discretion would be introduced when a judge imposes the mandatory life sentence for murder. A judge may, on the facts of a particular case, decide in his or her opinion, on all the facts of the case, a minimum period should be served within that life tariff. However, the bill is drafted so they may also decide not to exercise that discretion and simply hand down the mandatory life sentence without any minimum tariff. ADVIC and I, as its patron, believe that judicial discretion remains critical in criminal justice scenarios. No two murders are the same. This bill allows the judiciary to reflect this lack of homogeneity among murderers, whilst at the same time, in certain cases, giving all parties the certainty that we have lacked, which has been appalling. As we sit here today, our colleagues in the lower house, and I'm delighted, because this has engendered activity, are debating the parole bill. One of the features of this bill is that the minimum period that must be served before the parole board may consider release should move upwards from 7 years to 12 years. And I am delighted, and the Senate should be delighted, to support that. Indeed, if my bill is progressed, this proposal will dovetail and complement my short bill. And I want you, Minister, to consider this bill in the context of the parole bill, because in the parole bill, on page 18, under eligibility, it says, when imposing sentence upon a person, a sentencing judge may impose a specified period during which that person shall not be eligible for parole. Now, that comes some way towards what I'm trying to say here, and I'm looking for an amendment. I'm hoping to, maybe it's too general, to create amendment around that. So I also support the development of judicial guidelines in this jurisdiction when it comes to a range of crime, up to and including murder, once this bill is progressed. We have no doubt that our own common law will organically develop such guidelines. This will subsequently become additive for the judiciary when considering if they have wished to apply a determinate minimum period to be served for murder before parole may be considered. More than most, and to the eternal credit, in my view, of all the people sitting in the public gallery today, they understand that justice needs to be balanced with the rights of both the victim and the offender. And I am suggesting that my bill plugs a critical legal and indeed moral gap in the legislation, whereby both scales of justice may be properly balanced. No longer will the disgrace continue that in all cases a murderer's victim's family will have to beg the system not to release the person who has murdered their husband or their wife or their brother or their sister or their uncle or their aunt after a mere 7 years or even 12 years, as may be the case. This is abhorrent, and it is an unspeakable burden the system currently places on the shoulders of men and women and children whose hearts have already been crushed, and it cannot, Minister, go on, and the public, as I sound them out, are not going to allow it go on. This bill will mean that individual judges, in their discretion, may now at least provide individual families certainty for a more significant period of time than has been the case. The highest courts in this land, while expressing concern about some mandatory minimum sentences, including most recently, have continually upheld the constitutionality of a mandatory life sentence for murder, as confirmed in the words of the former Chief Justice as being so abhorrent and offensive to society that it merits a mandatory life sentence. It has been over 2 decades since we have been promised that the parole board in Ireland, established in 2001, would be placed on a statutory footing. The parole board bill, initiated by Deputy O'Callaghan, as I say, is in the Dáil and being debated today. But it's unclear, and I would like clarity on this in relation to my amendment, that we will see it enacted in the lifetime of this House within the Oireachtas. We need action now, and it's not good enough for the family of victims to go through the harrowing ordeal of a court trial, see a murderer put behind bars for life, only to learn that he or she, and unfortunately it is normally a he, was released after less than 20 years, a decision that is vested entirely in the Minister. I believe, and many others believe likewise, including the Law Reform Commission and the Government's own Penal Review Group, that recommendations by the actual trial judge, who listened to all the evidence as to a particular murder, would deliver fairer decisions than both the Parole Board and the Minister as to whether a murderer should in fact be released from custody. My bill is a simple one, and it's to protect the families of victims who feel justice is not in fact being served for their loved one if a murderer can walk the streets after 18 years. I hope to work with the Minister I have learned here that you need to communicate together. I've learned here that you need to listen and learn and come together to be part of the common good and to get law right for both. I am asking that we have some equality in the law here. And I am also asking that my amendments to the parole bill will be taken. We have ceased in this country, in my opinion, to understand the profundity of what happens when a life is taken willfully and purposefully. We don't understand anymore what that means. I am a great believer in equality of the law. There is reams of legislation about the offender. Reams of it. We're running around with it and having more committees. But what about the offended sitting here? In Ireland, we are very quick to give women life sentences for having babies outside marriage. But we won't, when it comes to murderers, it's an entirely different story. We have lost a sense of what violence means. We use violence every day. We communicate through violence. We are entertained by violence. It's part of the social media discourse. Anybody who works in the public eye will know that. We've become immune to what taking a life actually means. The loss of hope, the loss of future, the loss of imagination, the loss of joy, and all that for the people left behind, who are literally murdered every day in their spirit and in their imagination and in their hope. We've become a society with no sense of shame. We are aghast at the horror of murder, but then we look away and move on. A judge who has sat through the entire trial should recommend how long a murderer remains in custody. They should determine when a murderer is fit for parole due to the nature of the crime. It is not one size fits all. Who decided that the mark of mandatory sentencing or of a progressive liberal state is one that tells its people that their life is worth 17 years? Who decided that? I believe in rehabilitation. I believe that people can atone for their sins. But before that happens, a price must be paid for their crimes. The price is being paid every day by the people sitting in the gallery. And I am demanding we have some equality around this. So, Minister, I leave it up to you now, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say, and especially in relation to the parole board and that particular area there that I have pointed out, and that it might feed in, and I might be able to feed into it and find some recourse to people who have been left without their loved ones forever.
Thanks.